Hi, I'm Cicely from STEMeetsU.
In this video, we'll talk about polar coordinates and polar functions. Firstly, I'll give you a brief introduction. My video can break into 3 parts. In the first part, I'm gonna briefly talk about the concept of polar coordinates or functions. Then we will also look at the history of them, basically how was it introduced and who was the first one to use them. In the last part, we're going to go through some important applications of them. Then let's begin. First of all, we should get to know what the polar coordinates are. So let's look at the definition of it. The polar coordinates of a point describe its position in terms of a distance from a fixed point, which is the origin, and an angle measured from a fixed direction, which is usually the east. So how can we express the polar coordinates mathematically? They're just quite similar to Cartesian coordinates, but the x becomes r, which is the distance, and the y becomes the theta, which is an angle. So we can look at this graph. The point P in this polar coordinate system is described by r, theta, and this means that P is at a distance of r from the origin, and the angle between the direction of P and the horizontal axis is theta. So we can clearly know the position of P relative to the origin in terms of its polar coordinates. Then let's briefly talk about the relationship between Cartesian coordinates and the polar coordinates. In a word, we should know how to convert r, theta to x, y. Basically, we have already known the distance from the origin and the angle. So we can simply use the trigonometric functions to carry out the conversion between the Cartesian coordinates and polar coordinates. So x equals to r cosine theta and y equals to r sine theta. Then what are polar functions? Similar to y equals to fx, a polar function looks like r equals to f theta, representing the relationship between r and theta. And here is a way to find the derivative. Basically, it's just to find the derivative of y and x in terms of theta separately and then carry out division. Here are several graphs of some typical polar functions. Then let's talk about the history of polar coordinates. Actually, it was Isaac Newton who firstly came up with this idea, but his work was not published immediately. And it was Jacob Bernoulli who detailedly wrote about polar coordinates and made it to public. Some important applications of polar coordinate system include the radar system. The basic principle of a radar system is just to detect and keep track of the movement of an object in terms of its distance and angle from the origin. And this mathematical concept is also widely used in other fields like navigation and meteorology. In conclusion, in this video, we get to know the basic concept of polar coordinates and functions. 2 key elements are the distance and the angle. Also, I briefly talk about the history of polar coordinates, and last, we mention some usages of them. In a word, the precision of polar coordinates in describing relative position and movement makes it very useful in many fields like military and meteorology. Thanks for listening.